Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So today I want to focus on or highlight a topic that I talked about last time when I did a way too long video on uh, mask and vaccine mandates. And, that's the topic of how efficacious are vaccines in preventing various outcomes related to COVID infection, either symptomatic or asymptomatic, um, transmission from the infected person to other people, uh, serious disease, hospitalization, and death. Uh, how much of a difference does it make to get vaccinated? And you know, I see when I see people talk about this issue online, they often present kind of a simplistic black and white picture of the issue. It kind of reminds me of a scene from a very funny Will Ferrell movie, Talladega Nights. So let me just play that for you, and you'll get an idea of what I
That was for
mean
you,
here.
you know that? I did just like you told me. If you ain't first, you're last.
What the hell are you talking about?
Well, you told me that day at school for career day. You came in and you said, if you ain't first, you're last.
Oh, hell, Ricky, I was high when I said that. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. You first, you're last. You can be second, you can be third, fourth, hell, you can be fifth.
So, hopefully you get an idea there of what I'm getting at. People give this impression when they talk about vaccines, and I see this not just from hardcore anti-vaxxers or anything, but even people who are vaccinated themselves and support people getting vaccinated. Uh, you have this sort of black and white picture where they say, well, the vaccines may prevent you from getting severely ill or in the hospital or dying, but they don't stop you from getting infected. They don't stop you from spreading it to other people. Or they just say that last part, particularly if they're against the vaccines. They don't stop you from getting infected. They don't stop you from transmitting it to other people. Um, so, you can say to that, well, just because it doesn't 100% stop you from getting infected, like, you can still get COVID if you're vaccinated, of course, just like you can still get, um, you know, polio if you're vaccinated for that, unless you get like 2 booster shots. In which case it almost eliminates the possibility of getting it. But most vaccines don't 100%. Really, all vaccines, I should say, don't 100% stop you from getting the disease. They just make it significantly less likely. So, you know, just like if you're not first, you're not necessarily last. You can be second, third, fourth, fifth, etc. If the vaccines don't 100% eliminate the possibility of your getting infected with the disease, well, they could 90% reduce it, or 80 or 70 or 60, heck, even 50. Um, but they're still reducing it. Um, so, I just want to talk in a little more detail about what exactly vaccines can and can't do. And, you know, suggest to you, based on the evidence that I'm going to go over, that, on one hand, they are a very powerful tool that we have for reducing uh, all kinds of negative outcomes from the presence of the COVID virus in our society. Um, but also, they're not so effective that we can just simply rely on vaccines and discard all other measures. Not bother wearing masks and have people gathering en masse in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, such as schools, for example. We've got a whole bunch of schools starting right now, and especially since the kids are largely unvaccinated, completely if they're under 12. That might not be such a good idea. But another thing that I should mention that I see happening a lot is that people tend to focus either simply because it grabs their attention, so they talk about it, or because they're trying to present evidence in a biased way to support their point of view. Is that people tend to focus on dramatic examples of where the vaccine didn't stop people from getting COVID. So, for example, people bring up the fact that in a town called Provincetown, Massachusetts, about a month ago, a whole bunch of people got infected with COVID. There was kind of a super spreader event where hundreds of people got infected with COVID at a festival in Provincetown, Massachusetts, where people were congregating into packed bars, so indoors without masks. And the majority of people who were infected were vaccinated. And people are like, well, I guess that means the vaccines don't work. Well, if you have a much higher proportion of people vaccinated than are unvaccinated, then it's possible for that to happen, especially in circumstances where there's a lot of virus sort of sitting there indoors. But nobody from that incident went to the hospital. Last I heard. In any case, the salient example of vaccines failing to stop people from getting infected with COVID, although most of the people who attended this festival didn't get infected with COVID, it sticks with people. And there are other examples like that. The same thing happens with vaccine safety issues. Because anytime there's an incident, like people who had blood clots from that appeared to be from vaccines, or people who had myocarditis or pericarditis, which are types of heart inflammation after taking the vaccine, of course, it was talked about a lot on the news. People heard about it a lot, and so, people are like, aha, the vaccines must not be safe. But the devil's in the details, right? If you look into it a little further, you find that these are very, very rare incidents, like on the order of somewhere between 1 in 100,000 and 1 in a million. And in general, side effects from the vaccines, although they do occur, pretty commonly, as they do with any medication, they're overwhelmingly mild and resolve within a day or two. Not in every case, certainly, but the vast majority of the time. And some people, quite a few people like myself, had no side effects from getting vaccinated. And as I talked about the other day, and I'll put a link to the video clip I showed in that episode in the description, there's no scientific reason to assume that we're going to have long-term side effects cropping up from the vaccines, months or years from now, that didn't show up within the first couple of months, after people took the vaccine, because the stuff that's in the vaccines dissipates from your body very quickly. So the mRNA that's in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, for example, it instructs your body to make the spike proteins that are present in the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and then in turn your immune system goes after those proteins, um, learns to recognize them and remembers them, so that when the real COVID virus comes into your body, your immune system will immediately recognize it and spring into action, have a more effective immune response than if you hadn't been vaccinated. Um, but the mRNA doesn't stay in your body. It's eliminated from your body within a day or two. Um, and let me just look for some data to show you about the vaccines. Okay, so here's some earlier data. This was this is cutting it off, it looks like. Not sure why that is. Okay, here we go. Yeah, this was from studies done back early this year, where, of course, at that time, the prevalent form of the virus was, well, there were several, but, it wasn't Delta. Typically, it was the Alpha variant. And, you can see all of these studies show massive reductions in the likelihood of infection. And there's two things to note here. One is that these were less infectious variants than the Delta variant is, but the other is this was relatively soon after people were vaccinated, so the levels of efficacy there are about what was found in the clinical trials, which they started measuring outcomes immediately after people were fully considered to be fully vaccinated, 2 weeks after they received their second dose. But some of the studies also show reductions in transmission among breakthrough cases over and above the amount of reduction in infection, which of course reduces transmission, because if you don't have COVID, you can't give it to somebody else, obviously. But some of the studies showed a further reduction in transmission over and above just vaccinated people being less likely to be infected, because if you have a less severe case of COVID, your viral load tends to be lower. Not always, depends on how they measure it, but often it's lower than in unvaccinated people who are infected, and there's the infection doesn't last as long, so you're contagious for a shorter period of time. Let's see, what do I want to show you next? Here's collation of some recent studies that specifically looked at the Delta variant, and one from Canada, one from the UK, one from Israel, showing respectively that in the UK there was an 88% lower chance of getting COVID if you were vaccinated than if you weren't, and specifically getting the Delta variant of COVID. For Canada, the study done there found 87% lower likelihood of getting sick with COVID if you were vaccinated. Israel, a bit lower, 64%, and that may be because Israel is a country that was ahead of everybody in getting vaccinated, or getting a large percentage of their population vaccinated. I think they had almost as many people vaccinated there by like the end of February. Approximately 62%, I believe, as is the case now. Um, they had a long plateau there. Um, but 64% is still, a whole lot better than zero, right? It's not 100%. It's not zero. It's, in between. And if you multiply that out over the population, if somebody is like, if 10 people are vaccinated and, the majority of them who are exposed to COVID, don't get infected, whereas, everybody who's unvaccinated and exposed to COVID does get infected. Obviously, I'm just making that up as an illustrative example, right? Not everybody gets infected if they're exposed to COVID anyway. But my point is, if they're not infected, they can't pass on COVID. So right there, that's cutting transmission of COVID a lot. And for every person who is kept from getting COVID by virtue of being vaccinated, that's one less person who's able to infect anybody else. And you multiply that out over a very large population that's vaccinated, you are going to get a significant impact on the amount of COVID cases or number of COVID cases present in the community. As you can see, even more effective than that at keeping people out of the hospital, even though it's the Delta variant, which infects you with a higher viral load. Oops. Let's see. So here's some other studies, all of which compared infection with the Alpha variant, the one that started in the UK back late last year, and the Delta variant. And as you can see, they all show pretty strong efficacy, a little bit weaker for the AstraZeneca vaccine than for Pfizer, but all of them well above 50% efficacy, even against the Delta variant. But in general, a little more efficacious against Alpha than Delta. So you see there in England, about 95% effectiveness in preventing folks who were vaccinated from getting infected with Alpha. So in other words, for every 20 people who were unvaccinated getting infected with COVID, only one vaccinated person was getting infected with COVID. For Delta, it looks like that's about 85%, so still pretty good. Scotland, very similar results, about 95-ish% for Alpha, about 80% efficacy for Delta. Israel, a more pronounced difference, where very, very high efficacy against the Alpha variants, like 97%, it looks like, something like that, and down to 64, I believe it was, against the Delta variant. But you have to bear in mind there that since folks in Israel were vaccinated a longer time ago, fully vaccinated a longer time ago than was the case in other places, you'd expect some decline. So one thing that England and Scotland did, for example, that Israel didn't do, was that they concentrated at first on giving everybody their first shot. And very few people had received second shots early on. But then they caught up with the second shots. So the second shots were received much later in the UK than was the case in Israel, where they gave people their first vaccine like in December and January, maybe February if you were younger, um, and then boom, 4 weeks later or whatever, 3 or 4 weeks later, they were getting their second shot. Canada did a similar thing to the UK. Spaced the doses out a bit, and as you can see there, they had very similar rates for Alpha and Delta. They actually started their vaccination campaign a lot later than uh, the UK and Israel, but they did catch up. Here's some data from Ontario, Canada's largest province. So basically what you find, unvaccinated people, a rate of, this is very recent data, so this is Delta variant predominantly. It's the dominant variant of COVID there, just as it is here. And I can't remember if I said this before, but the Delta variant of COVID is more than twice as infectious as the original so-called wild virus that first infected us. But anyway, so what they found was that for cases, about 40 out of 100,000 people over the last over the few days this survey was taken were getting infected with COVID if they were unvaccinated, whereas only about 4 people out of 100,000 were getting infected with COVID if they were fully vaccinated. As far as hospitalization, 2 out of 100,000 were winding up in the hospital if they got COVID. So, out of approximately 5% of the people who got in symptomatic cases, 1 out of 100,000 were winding up in intensive care. Partial vaccination, all lower. Now for full vaccination, so 4 out of 100,000 getting infected, only 0.1 out of 100,000 were getting hospitalized, and only 0.02 out of 100,000 were winding up in intensive care. So, very, very effective at preventing people from contracting severe illness. Less effective, but still quite effective. 4.4 out of 100,000 compared to 39.5 out of 100,000 getting infected if they were vaccinated versus if they were unvaccinated. Here's some data that I also showed you the other day, if you watched that episode, from Israel. And this is looking specifically at severe cases. So you're not vaxxed, a lot less likely to get a severe case than fully vaxxed. Just out of curiosity, how did that compare to here? Much higher rate per 100,000, but less, about a third the rate of severe cases overall in fully vaxxed people. For people under 50, only 3.9 out of 100,000 who were not vaxxed got severe COVID, whereas 92 out of 100,000 who were not vaxxed, who were over 50, got COVID. So there's a very, very big age difference there in having severe cases of COVID. But if people were fully vaxxed, the rate of severe cases goes down from 3.9 per 100K for people not vaxxed to 0.3 cases per 100,000 for people who were fully vaccinated and under 50. So a 13-fold reduction Similarly, big reduction for people over 50 who were fully vaxxed. So unvaxxed, 92 cases per 100,000 were severe. Only 13.6 cases per 100,000 were severe for fully vaxxed. Which, note, it's a lot lower than 91.9. It's about eight-fold lower, but it's actually higher than the rate of severe cases for people who are not vaxxed who are under 50. So basically, what that's showing you is that our immune systems on average don't work as well when we get older. So even though the vaccine is helping us a lot, um, you know, going down by a factor of 8 in rate of severe cases, you're starting from a lower baseline. Your immune system, in general, on average, doesn't work as well the older you get. You can see this even more clearly when you look at the data broken down even more finely by age. So you can see here basically people who are under 30 only pretty rarely get severe cases, like anywhere from 0.3 to 100,000 for 12 to 15-year-olds to 1.5 to 100,000 for people in their 20s. But if they get fully vaxxed, in this study, no cases of severe cases of COVID were found in people under 30. So it makes a big difference if you're fully vaxxed, even though you're not at that much risk of having a severe case of COVID that would put you in the hospital if you're under 30. At the same time, it's definitely not zero. Zero is better than not zero. And also, this doesn't take into account that young people, as I've talked about before, actually have a pretty high rate of getting long COVID, which is where you have severe symptoms of various sorts for months at a time, or even indefinitely. Maybe the rest of your life. You can have permanent health damage as a result of getting COVID, even if you're young. And even if you only got a mild case of COVID, it turns out that can happen to you. But anyway, looking further at the data, for every age range, getting vaccinated has a huge impact in terms of reducing your likelihood of getting a severe case of COVID or being hospitalized. But because older people's immune systems work so much less well, if they're not vaccinated, they're highly vulnerable to getting a severe case of COVID, much more so than young people are. And even if they're vaccinated, so compare 47.9 here for fully vaxxed people 80 to 89 years old, 47.9 out of 100,000 get severe cases of COVID. And this is out of the whole population, not out of the population of people who were infected with COVID, right? That's actually a little bit higher than people in their 50s who are not vaccinated. So people in nursing homes, mostly elderly people, are kind of sitting ducks if people are coming in and out of the nursing home who are not vaccinated and or are not wearing masks. Even if they've been vaccinated, it's not that unlikely that they could get a severe case of COVID if they're heavily exposed to the virus. Nonetheless, comparing their rates of severe cases for unvaccinated people, look at that. It goes down by a factor of 10 if you're in your 70s and you're fully vaxxed, as opposed to if you're not vaxxed. So, the vaccinations are making a big difference, but, they're by no means eliminating people's risk unless they're very young, but definitely not if they're like over 70. Here's another study, I think from Israel, just comparing, or no, the UK, I think, comparing severe cases for people ages 60 and up, unvaccinated versus partially vaccinated versus fully vaccinated. severe cases by age group. So same data as Israel. Being fully vaccinated definitely helps you a lot, regardless of your age. But fully vaxxed people in their 80s or 90s, still have, still are more likely to develop severe cases of COVID than anybody who's under 50, regardless of their vaccination status. Actually, anybody who's under 60. Let's see. Okay, I think. Sorry. Here's some data that's are from the U.S. So I did a statistical analysis on cases per 100,000 in the 10 most vaccinated states in the United States, comparing them to the 10 least vaccinated states in the United States. So the less vaccinated states had a mean rate of COVID cases per 100,000 over the course of average daily rate of new cases, averaged out over a week, of 62.8 new cases per 100,000 people. So that was the 10 lowest vaccinated states. And the 10 highest vaccinated states, the 10 states with the highest vaccination rate, only had 20.9 new cases a day per 100,000 occurring. So about a threefold difference there. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Another thing that people have looked at is transmission of the virus since the Delta variant came onto the scene. The study from Imperial College of London compared fully vaccinated individuals to unvaccinated individuals. And the way they did the study was they just randomly tested people, irrespective of their vaccination status, without knowing, anything about them beforehand. You just tested them to see if they tested positive or not. So just random samples of people either fully vaccinated or unvaccinated, and found that the fully vaccinated participants were 3 times less likely to test positive for COVID than unvaccinated individuals. So, 75 out of 100 people who tested positive for COVID were unvaccinated, in other words. And, again, this is regardless of whether it's symptomatic or asymptomatic. So the tests are picking up asymptomatic cases as well, and those are more likely to be people who are vaccinated. And so you find that this 3-to-1 ratio is higher than that. People are more protected if they're vaccinated against symptomatic COVID. But in addition, they looked, let's see if they talk about it. Okay, yeah, they looked at uh, the test results at various points and found that fully vaccinated people were less likely than unvaccinated people to have a you know high level of the virus in their system. They had a smaller viral load on average. What they call the CT value was lower, um, and so they're less likely to pass on the virus even if they're infected. Um, let's see if I can find another study for you. Yeah. So this study, which didn't randomly test people, instead what they did was they simply tested people who they knew were infected. Um, and so when they compared vaccinated people's test values with unvaccinated people's test values, they found um, similar CT values, cycle threshold values, which are basically their index of the amount of infection of virus present in the nasal cavity, which it's sort of roughly correlated with infectiousness, but you see what most of these studies that just measure cycle threshold values, as in that's what the test does, right? It, you know like amplifies the amount of virus in the sample until they get a positive test, and basically the number of times they have to do that to get a positive test is an indication of how much virus is in your system. So the higher the cycle threshold value, the more times they have to do that in order to get a test result that is positive. The lower the level of virus in your system. However, what they don't do in those studies, they just look at CT values, is they don't test, they don't culture the virus to find out if it's infectious or not. In other words, is it alive or is it dead? But they did that in this study. And they found that even though there were similar CT values in vaccinated versus unvaccinated people who were infected with COVID, they found less infectious virus in people who were vaccinated. And in addition, they found that the amount of virus in their system decreased more rapidly than it did for unvaccinated people. And several studies have found the same thing. Often people will pick out specific countries that have high vaccination rates, which there aren't very many of those, and truthfully, no country at this point has an extremely high vaccination rate because no country is vaccinating kids under 12 yet, right? Um, but Iceland's pretty high. They're at I think 75%. Um, and yeah, despite this high vaccination rate, where um, you know the vast majority of the adult population has been vaccinated. Let me put this up on the screen for you. So despite their high vaccination rate, Iceland currently has the highest number of daily new cases that they've had throughout the pandemic, which that's not really saying much necessarily, because in the majority of the pandemic, they have had relatively few cases. Because they've shut their borders down. They've sacrificed one of their main sources of income, tourism, in order to protect themselves from the virus. I guess they do let people in eventually if they quarantine and continue to test negative. But in any case, uh, they haven't had a lot of cases, and they've only had 30 deaths the entire pandemic. Now, Iceland is a very small country population-wise. They've only got about 300,000 people, but still, 30 deaths is awfully low. 10,000 cases is not very many. The vast majority of U.S. states, even the very low population ones like Montana, have had a lot more COVID cases than that. But they are having a spike despite the high rate of vaccination. Well, does that mean that the vaccines aren't working for preventing infection? Well, again, they're not having as many cases as U.S. states that are having spikes, and they still haven't had anybody die. Despite this spike, they haven't had a single death from COVID since May. And I was just looking at their hospitalization rate the other day. It's about a third of what the U.S.'s is. So they're definitely doing a lot better. In terms of vaccine efficacy, even though they're reporting a higher rate of infections than they've ever had, you're still a lot less likely to get infected if you're vaccinated than if you're not. They reported efficacy of 60% against any infection. In other words, you were 60% less likely to test positive for COVID, irrespective of whether it was symptomatic or asymptomatic. Although probably some asymptomatic people didn't get tested. I haven't had a chance to look at that study, but in any case, definitely a lower probability of getting infected, and a much lower probability of getting severe disease if you were vaccinated, typically with Pfizer. Let's see. So data are changing now in Israel. They previously had because they have you know the highest the vast majority of their elderly population is vaccinated, and as we talked about, like 90% of their population over like 60 or 70 is vaccinated, and you're much more likely to get a severe case even if you're vaccinated, but you're over like 60 or 70 than you are to get a severe case if you're younger, like in your 40s on down, even if you're unvaccinated. So recently, though, Israel started rolling out booster shots for its elderly population. And so they've been cutting their rate of infections. Oops, I got to go to a different browser because I've reached my limit in this one. So I started administering a third dose of the Pfizer vaccine, the one that they're using overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, in Israel, to people over 60. And the rate of disease spread among vaccinated people over 60 began falling steadily around August 13th, so about 2 weeks after they started giving people their third doses, and has dipped below 1. So, you just, in case you're not familiar with the terminology, what's called R naught is a value indicating how infectious a disease is if you don't do anything to try to stop it from spreading. Um, and it's about 3 for original COVID, and it's somewhere between 5 and 8 for the Delta variant. So they think it's roughly twice as infectious as original COVID. But then, uh, you know, it's much lower than that if you take measures to mitigate the spread of it, such as lockdowns or wearing masks or getting vaccinated and so forth. And oh, I'm sorry, I didn't explain what the R actually is. That's an estimate of the average number of people any given person who's infected with a virus is likely to infect. So, in other words, absent any mitigating measures, the average person with the original virus was likely to infect 3 other people while they were sick with COVID. Uh, with Delta, the average person is likely to infect somewhere between 5 and 8 people, absent their wearing a mask or staying home and all that. And so, in order to, reduce the number of cases, you have to get that R value below 1. So each person who's infecting on average less than one other person. Countries that successfully controlled the virus, of course, did that. China, New Zealand, and so forth got their R values down well below 1 when they shut down their borders and locked down and so forth toward the beginning of the pandemic last year. And because they continue to keep the virus out of their countries for the most part, they've been able to resume fairly normal life a lot of the time since then, most of the time since then. Anyway, so let's see. I don't see this in here, but in any case, I guess it was somewhere else I saw this that you'll recall they're finding efficacy rates of preventing infection in Israel that are around 60 some odd percent in some studies, and lower than that in some other studies that have been done in Israel actually. So suggesting that there's been a decline in efficacy of the vaccinations against preventing infection over time, and it's been like many months since most people in Israel were vaccinated. But once those elderly people started getting their booster shots, the efficacy of the vaccine after that third dose went up to about 86%. So it sounds like even against Delta variant, a fairly recent vaccination can greatly boost your immune response. Oh gosh, we've gone on for too long. Let me just show you one other thing here, and then we'll call it a night. So in Canada, they've been, unlike in the United States, keeping careful track of new cases and vaccinated versus unvaccinated people. So Saskatchewan, for example, every day since they started posting daily results, they've had a lot more unvaccinated than fully vaccinated people getting infected. Okay, so the other day, okay, they had a little higher figure on August 20th. 50 out of 240 cases were fully vaccinated. 183 were unvaccinated. But it's, still more than 3-to-1 ratio there. 18 versus 159 on August 19th, and so on. All these are very impressive statistics. So, bottom line on all this is that despite the presence of the Delta variant that's much more infectious than earlier variants of the disease, the vaccines are still holding up well, not only in preventing hospitalization and death, but also in greatly reducing the likelihood of people getting infected and in turn their ability to transmit the virus to other people. And there does seem to be significant evidence that if you had the shots a long time ago, like 4 to 6 months ago or something like that, the efficacy does start to decline, which is why the CDC here in the United States has indicated that they're going to start giving people the opportunity to get booster shots approximately 8 months after your second shot, so starting in early September. But we have to keep in mind that particularly since it's going to be many months before we can start vaccinating young children under 12, we can't rely on vaccines alone to control the pandemic. We're probably, if we want to get out of this thing, we're probably going to need to look at, or we're probably going to need to do what places like New Zealand and China and really a lot of places around the world, even the UK did at some point during the pandemic, where basically they said we're going to just not let you be in public indoors for a while. No indoor restaurant dining. Either you'll have your food delivered to you, or you can do pickup at a grocery store. Work from home if you can. Only essential frontline workers will be working in person. That's what we're going to have to do. We're not going to be able to have in-person school. Even with masks, there's still some chance of getting infected, especially since the vast majority of the kids are not vaccinated. So we're going to have to take many different steps if we want to exit this pandemic. And bear in mind what it's doing to us right now. People seem to have sort of acclimated to having COVID in our society at a high rate here in the United States. But I mean, it's killed over 600,000 people. That's an underestimate. Millions and millions of people have developed long COVID, chronic disease that they may never recover from, or if they do, it'll be a while, with often highly debilitating symptoms. 2.5 million people have been hospitalized with COVID. Millions and millions of people have lost loved ones. This is like the biggest catastrophe that's befallen our country in many, many decades. And it's not going to stop until we take multiple steps ranging from vaccinating a higher percentage of our population to another lockdown, wearing masks diligently, like having mandated masks in public indoor spaces, and so forth. I was just listening to a discussion today from the World Socialist website. They interviewed several scientists. I'll put a link to that in the description of the video. And one of them was saying basically, because the Delta variant is so infectious, we're going to have to both take China or New Zealand like measures in controlling our borders and doing contact tracing and locking down for however long it takes, a few weeks probably, like maybe 6 to 8 weeks, as well as getting our vaccination rate up if we want to get that R value down below 1 and eliminate COVID. And really, elimination is the only viable strategy for returning to normal life in any sort of reliable manner. Because if we just let the virus linger around, it's going to keep mutating. We're going to keep having variants that are more vaccine resistant, and we're just going to continue to have problems. And I don't think that's what we want. Okay, so that's all for now. I will see you next time.